Hi, I'm Matt Shoemaker. Today on Tech Forum we drive the Model 3. Good morning, guys. Today we're going to discuss driving dynamics of the Model 3. And I figured one important thing to point out before we get going is when you get in the car, you'll notice the steering wheel is very small. I actually prefer this. Most race drivers prefer a smaller and thicker steering wheel, which is exactly what Tesla has given us. They were able to shrink the steering wheel partly because there's no gauge binnacle in front of the wheel. And when there's a gauge binnacle in front of the wheel, often that necessitates a slightly larger steering wheel to give a clearer view of the steering wheel or of the speedometer and or tachometer. And in this instance, you obviously don't need that in an electric car. You're not paying attention to engine revs and boost pressure and that type of thing. So the minimal display information that's needed is on the center screen. So that clears up the view in front of the wheel, which means you can shrink the size of the steering wheel. So that's one thing to point out right off the bat. The size and the thickness of the steering wheel is very nice. And so there's a couple other things that no one really pays much attention to when driving a Model 3, and that is seating position. Your seating position does indeed affect the driving dynamics of the car, and so in most cars, such as smaller sports cars, you're sitting very, very low. And with the Model 3, that's not the case. And though it looks like it may indeed be a little bit of a low car, it's really not. A good portion of the reason for that that nobody really mentions is the battery pack under the floor. Now, people mention the battery being under the floor, but they mention it mainly just to explain or describe the packaging of the Model 3 and or why it corners the way it does. Having that 1,000-pound, it's actually, I believe, 1,052 pounds, if I'm remembering correctly, having that 1,000-pound battery pack beneath the floor. In fact, there's an image on the screen of what the battery pack looks like. It takes up, quite literally, the entire floor of the car. Tesla calls that the skateboard. And so that skateboard underneath the car, that battery pack, that's low, it gives it good handling dynamics, but it's also thick. That thick battery pack adds about 3.5 inches, if I believe, if I'm correct on this, 3.5 inches of height to the floor. Now, I considered this before I purchased the car, knowing that the thickness of the battery pack was indeed going to affect the seating position, and so I was a little bit concerned about that, and that the seating position would be somehow odd, but I've never heard any reviewers mention it. They just mention the battery's under the floor, it makes it handle well. That's it. But what they don't think of bringing up is the thought that that battery pack does raise you up. Now, you get used to it. It is there, however, but you do get used to it, and so I'm trying to think of a good way to describe it. You sit up higher, which feels very strange compared to other cars. In fact, it's immediately noticeable, and why no other reviewers point this out, I don't have a clue. You get in the car and you're sitting physically upright. Right now, I have the seat down as low as I can set it, and yet I'm sitting up. Add on top of that the lower dash, and you really feel like you're sitting high. Now, if you're looking for a pure sports car, this isn't necessarily the car for you. It does handle really, really well. As I mentioned in the first video, the acceleration is phenomenal. Fantastic, as I would have said in the last video. It does corner very, very tight. I mean, it's extremely responsive, very, very nimble. But it being that you sit up higher, It's a pleasing seating position. And again, I wasn't sure if I was going to like the seating position being up high as it is, but I really, really do. And I notice it primarily when I climb out of the Model 3 and get into one of my other cars. And with the Model 3, to a certain extent, you feel perched on top of it because the fact that the battery pack is thick, raising you up, and the dashboard is low, and you have large glass with the visibility around. To a certain extent, anyway, you have a little bit of the feel of an SUV sitting in this car, and that may upset some people to hear, but it's really not a bad thing. It's just something you get used to. So that's I know I've spent a lot of time explaining that, but it's something worth noting that no other reviewer points out. But I do feel it every time I climb out of my Model 3 and go into one of my other cars. It's immediately apparent that the floor is lower, therefore the seating's lower. And so next, the ride quality. Early Model 3s were said to have a very rough ride quality. Now my car's early car, it's in the low 9,000s for the VIN number, and yet my car rides very nice. Now, I haven't driven multiple other Model 3s to compare, but I know that early on, Tesla made suspension changes and to address ride rough quality that was brought up by some of the Model 3, early Model 3 owners. And so I believe this is one of the cars with the suspension revision. And I say I believe that it is primarily because, again, it drives very smooth. I wouldn't call it plush, but sports sedan quality. I see why the Model 3 has been billed as a competitor to the BMW 3 Series. It very much has that feel to it, and so it is supple enough to not be harsh. My wife has she's sensitive to the way cars drive, the road quality, and this car is in no way rough. Again, if I had to compare it to one of my other cars, I'd say the Fusion comes closest. That car is it feels very similar to this car in the ride quality, and so smooth, not at all rough, just tight enough to get very good cornering. I haven't yet pulled the panels off the bottom of the car to inspect the sway bars, but they must be thick because there's very little body roll. And excuse me. So yes, ride quality very good. The overall cornering potential of the car is quite good. There are tire pressure monitors in this car. Right now it's 54 degrees out. Tire pressure is listed as 44 pounds, 44 psi. The factory delivers the car at 48 to 50 psi. When it warms up, when the weather's warmer, I get 48 to 50 psi shown on the screen. And the individual tire pressure monitors are very, very nice. But they, even at high tire pressures, the cornering is very good, and it's got green tires, highly efficient tires, and yet it still corners very well. If you drop the tire pressure down 10 psi and get it into the high 30s, low 40s range, it corners even better. And with better tires and or 19-inch or 20-inch wheels, it would corner even better. But it corners really well. And on top of that, the rear wheel drive is actually quite nice. I've heard one other reviewer, Parker from Vehicle Virgins, mentions that with the rear wheel drive the car is playful. I definitely can echo that sentiment. It is playful. Mid corner, you get on it real hard, it will step just a tiny bit, just enough to be very pleasant. And so I guess probably the biggest compliment that I can give is that when I get out of my Model 3 and get into another car, say my little SI, I get in that car, and as much as I love it, as much as I enjoy that car, it's still brand new. It only has 5,000 miles on it, and my Model 3 has 4,285 miles on it already. So they're very similar in mileage, both basically brand new cars. Step out of the Model 3 into my little SI, and honestly, the first thought is there something wrong with this car? Is the turbo not working? It feels dog slow. I mean, dog slow. Even though it's a relatively quick car, it feels like a dog compared to this thing. There's just no torque there, and it though the cornering is as sharp in my Civic Si as it is to my Model 3, it is the ride quality in the Civic is harsh, whereas the Model 3 ride quality is far better. And so you get good ride quality and phenomenal cornering in this car. And so I know there's a massive price difference between the two, so it's a poor comparison, but it's a comparison worth making, primarily because the again, it's not until you step away from something that you can appreciate what you have. And stepping out of a Model 3 into another car is, at least the cars I own, is just night and day. Every other car we own feels like it's stuck in the Stone Age. And then I get back in the Model 3 and it feels torquey and fast, sharp handling, but still smooth. The refinement is very, very high. I would say that if I had to ding this car in any way, shape, or form, it would be just the lack of visceral impact that you get from a gas engine and from the experience of shifting gears, slipping a clutch, dealing with turbo lag and that kind of thing. And but there is definitely no lack in performance. That brings me to comfort, which is also part of driving dynamics. The car is quite comfortable. It is it's an enjoyable car on long trips. If I'm on the expressway for more than, say, 45 minutes and I start to get groggy, then I can just activate the autopilot and you know, just enjoy the drive. Autopilot does not make you groggy in any way. I've heard a few people say that they're worried that autopilot is going to encourage falling asleep, but it really doesn't. What I found is if I get groggy, I can turn it on, I can rub my eyes, I can stretch my neck. As long as I'm paying attention to what I'm doing, leave my hand laid on the wheel, just so I can take over at any time, it allows me the opportunity to look around a little bit and to take my eyes off of being fixated on the roadway. And that actually very much reduces fatigue, not having to stare out the windshield. I believe it's the staring out the windshield that makes you, it's somewhat hypnotic and makes you more groggy while you drive, and the autopilot really does eliminate that from the equation. So I'm going to turn left here at this light, and I'm going to floor it and turn so you can get an idea of the traction control. So and there I am. By the time I had rounded that corner, I was at 45. The traction control was kicking in, and as I could hear the wheels spinning, and yet it still pulled very hard, accelerating through that corner. And that kind of gives you an idea. The car, the regen works very, very well. So go 45, and I'm letting off. This is purely regen. And that was slightly downhill as well. So that gives you guys an idea of how well the regen works. You get down to about 8 miles an hour and the regen is barely working. I'll stop and floor it. We're going uphill here. So battery pack's cold, and that was quite a bit uphill, and my trunk is still full. So it was a bad case scenario, but that gives you an idea. Now if we slow it down around 20 or so and get on it, it pulls 20 to 50 is the sweet spot, as I mentioned in my introduction video. So day-to-day living with the Model 3, again, the climbing in and out of the cockpit is nice. I'll say that the armrests are at an equal height, which is not very common. I've had other cars that the armrests are different in height. The armrest, the center armrest is very wide. There's room for both people to put their arms, which again, not all that common. The armrest goes far enough forward that you can get your about half your forearm on it. My other cars, I've noticed the armrest is back here, so you can barely catch your elbow on the edge of it. But this one, it's far enough forward. The cup holders are low enough that a small water bottle or the typical average size mug fits below the surface of the armrest, so you're not bumping into that. So all of those things play together for a very nice experience. I brought up Autopilot earlier. I will be doing a video purely on Autopilot alone. You can keep your eyes open for that. And this has been quite the experience owning this car. It is definitely a car that I thoroughly love. When I bought it, I was assuming that I'd be purchasing an EV, and that EV was just going to be eco-friendly, that there was really going to be very little that when purchasing this car, I was assuming that I was just purchasing an EV to be eco-friendly and save on gas and be reliable. But the Model 3 has truly proven to be a performance-oriented sedan. Though the Model 3 is a little bit heavier than your average car, I believe it's 3,800 pounds, if I'm remembering correctly. Not a light car. I thought, well, yeah, the weight's down low, that's going to help, but it's still a heavy car, it's going to feel heavy. It does not feel heavy at all. This car feels very light, very nimble, and it is it's responsive. It is in every way it plays the part of a sports sedan, and it is far better at the role at which Tesla has assigned it than I ever thought possible. And the steering is very tight. I would say that as other reviewers have mentioned, they say there's basically zero road feel coming through the steering wheel. I don't know that there's zero road feel, but there's very little. The feel coming through the wheel is a little bit numb, but that numb feeling coming through the wheel is in no way it in no way detracts from the driving experience. I think part of that is because it's electric power steering and the Autopilot system having such access to the steering. I think that numbs a bit of the road feel coming through the wheel. But the road feel coming through the suspension is quite good. You can feel pretty much everything going on the road surface through the seat. So the lack of feel through the steering wheel is easily forgiven, because again, you can tell what's going on through the seat. The steering feel is wonderful. The steering weight is good. I leave it in comfort mode actually, and I find the tension to be fine. Standard gives a little bit more, and obviously Sport gives an even heavier wheel. But that as you change the steering wheel settings, and we'll go into that when I cover items in the touch screen. But when you change the setting from comfort to normal to Sport, all it does is it changes the level of assist through the steering wheel. It does not affect the road feel in any way. So, but I prefer it in comfort, and I like a light wheel. Although ironically, in my my SI, I prefer Sport mode. That firms up the suspension and the steering wheel weight. So every car is different. But so yes, the road feel is numbed through the wheel on a Model 3. But again, it does not, at least in my opinion, does not detract from the driving experience. Also, the fact that it's rear-wheel drive with so much torque, mid-corner, if you step on it, it will start to step just enough to rotate the car additionally. and but the traction control will kick in. If you set it for slip start, it reduces the traction control effect, and you can get it to step out. Now, I wouldn't call it drifting, but with slip start activated, it will step out just enough to really add some fun to the drive. So I recommend using slip start if you're going to be doing spirited driving. You do get an icon that permanently comes up on the screen that mentions that slip start is enabled, and you have to manually enable it every time you get in the car. You can't set it into your profile that I'm aware of. So thanks guys for watching. Feel free to go ahead and click the link below to subscribe. Next week, be sure to tune in. We'll be going through everything on the touch screen, the various programs, menus, submenus, and how it all works. Thanks a lot.